The mist clung to Willowbrook like a shroud, thick and unforgiving, carrying secrets that should have stayed buried. In the summer of 1856, when the heat pressed down on Louisiana's forgotten corners like the palm of a fevered god, a tale began to unfold that would never find its way into any official record. It's a story about two women, refined and charitable, who served mercy by the bowl and damnation by the bite. Because in that cursed year, the smoke that rose from Thornfield Hollow carried more than the aroma of cured meat and oak. It carried a sin so deep, so carefully concealed, that an entire community chose blindness over truth when the feast tasted too divine to question. This is the account of Celeste and Ophelia Marchand, the flesh merchants of Louisiana. Before we venture deeper into this tale of appetite and horror, remember that the most terrifying stories are those we choose not to see, even when the evidence sits before us on our very plates. The settlement of Willowbrook was barely a mark on any map. Just 32 weathered homes arranged like broken teeth around a muddy square, a timbered chapel that leaned slightly eastward as if perpetually bowing in prayer, and a general store that served as courthouse when needed. Most seasons, the earth was soft as pudding. The insects formed living clouds that moved like dark thoughts across the sky, and breathing felt like drowning in warm honey. Survival was harsh. Game was scarce, and when the floods arrived, which happened regularly as clockwork, the roads vanished entirely, leaving folks to subsist on salt, faith, and whatever protein they could acquire. The people of Willowbrook were the kind who had fled from somewhere else, carrying burdens too heavy to name. There was old Claude Boudreau, the wheelwright, whose hands shook from memories of what he'd done in New Orleans before the fever took his conscience. Marie Thibodeau, the seamstress, who spoke to her dead children as if they still sat at her kitchen table. The Rousseau family, whose patriarch had gambled away a plantation and now pretended nobility while his children wore shoes with holes. Thomas Melancon, the trapper, who drank to forget the winter he'd eaten things no Christian should consume. These were people acquainted with hunger, with desperation, with the kind of moral flexibility that comes when civilization becomes a luxury you cannot afford. Yet there existed one establishment where meat never seemed scarce. At the settlement's edge, where the ancient oaks grew dense and shadows never lifted even at high noon, stood the Marchand Preservation House, a peaked structure with weathered planks that had turned silver gray from years of smoke and moisture, and a chimney that breathed constantly like the throat of some great buried beast. It belonged to Celeste, the elder sister, keen-eyed and elegant in bearing, with fingers that moved like water when she worked, and Ophelia, the younger, soft-voiced, perpetually adorned with ivory combs in her dark hair and crimson stains beneath her nails that she claimed came from berry preserves. The community cherished them like patron saints of sustenance. When disease claimed a family's livestock, the sisters would deliver cured ham wrapped in fine cloth, their faces serene as Madonna paintings. During the brutal winter of '55, when sickness killed the poultry and wildlife vanished into the deeper swamps as if nature itself had abandoned the hollow, the Marchand sisters sustained everyone. Their generosity was legendary, their kindness unwavering, their meat impossibly tender and seasoned with herbs that seemed to unlock flavors no one had ever tasted before. Nobody questioned the source, at least not openly. The sisters claimed connection to a merchant network, a mysterious trading partner up north who shipped barrels of preserved meats down the river routes. Others believed they maintained wild livestock deep in the wetlands where none dared venture, in clearings protected by Cherokee spirits or Confederate deserters. Some wondered briefly, but wondering meant hunger, and the sisters ensured no soul went empty. The preservation house sat beyond their dwelling, an elongated, low building with iron fixtures and heavy chains securing the entrances like a fortress built to keep things in rather than out. It remained locked except during curing days, when the chimney expelled dense black vapor that rolled across the village like a blessing, and the scent spread like an enchantment across every home and hearth. People detected rosemary and thyme in the aroma, bay leaves and black pepper, even exotic spices that spoke of trade routes and distant ports. Yet there was always another note, subtle and metallic, like copper pennies left too long in rain. Most ignored it, their stomachs too grateful to question their noses. Only Pastor Laurent. Delicate lace window treatments filtered the harsh Louisiana sun into something softer, more forgiving. A harpsichord missing just 2 keys still managed to produce melodies that drifted through open windows on summer evenings, sad and sweet as forgotten lullabies. The sitting room featured their deceased mother's portrait, a stern woman with Celeste's eyes and Ophelia's mouth, painted in oils that seemed to follow visitors around the room. An ornate timepiece sat on the mantel, brass and mahogany, that ran exactly 4 minutes slow, as if time itself moved differently in their domain. No gentleman callers ever appeared at their door, though both sisters possessed the kind of beauty that should have attracted suitors from parishes as far as Baton Rouge. No livestock was visible on their property, no chicken coops or pig pens or cattle in the fields. No visitor was ever permitted to examine what they stored beyond the locked doors of the preservation house. But people noticed something else. Something that should have raised alarm, but instead became just another curiosity to file away and forget. Travelers passed through Willowbrook regularly, following the old trade routes between New Orleans and the northern settlements. Trappers seeking beaver and muskrat, merchants hauling goods, wanderers fleeing debt or law or broken hearts. They often sought lodging or trade with the Mouchons, drawn by the sisters' reputation for hospitality. The sisters, always gracious, would offer refreshments, washing facilities, and warm meals that travelers claimed were the finest they'd ever tasted. They would praise the tenderness of the meat, the richness of the gravies, the way the flavors seemed to linger on the tongue for hours. A trader from Mobile named Samuel Cartwright was last observed entering their home in May, his wagon loaded with bolts of fine cloth and cases of imported wine. He had boasted to half the town about the profits he expected to make selling to the plantation wives upriver. His wagon was later discovered floating in the bayou, empty of goods, the horses nowhere to be found. A fur dealer from Arkansas named Benjamin Hayes had spent an evening in the general store talking about his plans to buy land near Shreveport, showing off a leather pouch full of gold coins. He knocked on the Marchand door the next morning, seeking breakfast before continuing his journey. The sisters welcomed him with their usual grace, and that was the last anyone saw of Benjamin or his gold. Explanations came easily, as they always do when people need them. He likely took the waterway north and sold his wagon for passage. She probably met a man and eloped without telling anyone. Men of that wandering sort never stay in one place long anyway. The town conducted no formal investigations, posed no uncomfortable questions. After all, provisions remained on every table, and hungry people have a remarkable capacity for overlooking inconvenient mysteries. Celeste often strolled through the village in her pressed dresses and dark gloves, delivering wrapped packages to widows and mothers with the dignity of a lady paying social calls. Her smile never wavered, her courtesy never faltered, her generosity never questioned. Children would run to greet her, knowing she always carried peppermint sticks in her reticule. Women would invite her for tea, eager to hear her opinions on fashion and literature. Men would tip their hats and speak of her late father with respect, remembering him as a gentleman of education who had owned books and played violin. Ophelia remained closer to home, tending the preservation fires and maintaining the mysterious processes that produced their endless bounty. Her apron often showed stains the color of rust or dried blood, but she claimed they came from berries and beets, from the natural dyes she used to color her preserving solutions. Children called her the silent cutter, partly because she spoke so softly you had to lean close to hear her words, and partly because of the way she moved her hands when she worked, precise and rhythmic as a seamstress at her needle. In the evenings, when the sun bled red through the cypress trees and night crept across the bayou like spilled ink, smoke would rise again from the preservation house chimney, black as midnight, curling like fingers into the dusk, carrying scents that made mouths water and stomachs rumble, even after supper had been cleared away. And Willowbrook would dine on the sisters' gifts, always grateful, always satisfied, never questioning why the meat tasted like nothing they had ever experienced before, why it seemed to satisfy hunger in ways that ordinary beef or pork never could. Nobody knew that beneath the preservation house floor, behind a second concealed entrance hidden by a false wall, lay a chamber lined with metal hooks hanging from oak beams, a stone platform stained dark with years of use, shackles bolted to the walls, sweet flesh, slow death, rendered well, young and pure, minimal waste, exceptional flavor. Struggled too much, meat grew tough, lesson learned. Not yet. At this point in the account, all the townspeople understood was that the sisters possessed a talent for flavor and preservation that bordered on miraculous. And their generosity never diminished, even in the harshest seasons. When questioned about their methods, Celeste would nearly smile that serene smile that reached her eyes and made questioners feel foolish for asking. Ancient family secrets, she would say, her voice carrying just a trace of her mother's French accent. Recipes passed down through generations of marchand women, refined and perfected over time. The town would chuckle and nod, chew more deliberately, wipe their mouths with satisfaction, and none of them, not even Pastor Laurent with his seminary education and his suspicions, would ask the question that hung in the air like smoke. What happened to the bones? Not yet, because hunger teaches people what to overlook with remarkable efficiency. And gratitude, when fed with warm flesh and quiet comfort, becomes a form of collective blindness more powerful than any conspiracy. The people of Willowbrook had learned to see only what they needed to see. While surrounding parishes starved from drought and livestock disease, while families in nearby Thibodaux and Houma buried children who had wasted away from hunger, while plantation owners slaughtered breeding stock they never requested payment for their generosity, asking only for whispered gratitude or perhaps a small favor to be returned someday when circumstances permitted. The grateful recipients called them saints, walking among mortals, angels sent to preserve life in a time of death. Some claimed their preservation house was blessed by powers beyond human understanding, that the sisters possessed knowledge passed down from wise women and root doctors, from Cherokee medicine men and Creole conjurers. But Pastor Lawrence, Willowbrook's newly stationed young minister, harbored doubts that grew like cancer in his chest, fed by observations that others either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. He had arrived from New Orleans in early spring, fresh from seminary with his head full of theology and his heart full of hope. The bishop had tasked him with reestablishing order and proper Christian faith in this forgotten body. They didn't wonder about the source of their prosperity when neighboring communities were reduced to eating bark and boiled leather. Laurent first noticed the pattern during a conversation with old Claude Boudreau, the wheelwright, whose workshop sat at the intersection of the main road and the path leading to the Marchand property. Claude was complaining that no outsiders brought him business anymore, that his skills with wagon wheels and axles were going to waste. "They come down the trade path regular enough," he grumbled, spitting tobacco juice into the mud, "but they don't seem to leave, at least not past the sister's place. They always stop there for hospitality, but somehow they never make it to my shop for repairs or shoeing." When Laurent pressed him for clarification, asking what he meant exactly, the old man grew uncomfortable and evasive. He spat again and muttered, "Ask the preservation house folk. They always seem to be eating good while the rest of us make do. Maybe they know something about where all these travelers end up." There was something in his tone, a note of resentment mixed with fear, that suggested Claude knew more than he was willing to say directly. Initially, Laurent assumed it was nothing more than swamp superstition mixed with jealousy, the kind of small-town resentment that develops when some prosper while others struggle. But then he began reviewing his parish records more carefully, cross-referencing the notes left by his predecessor with his own observations of the community. A mute youth, barely 15, seeking work and carrying letters of recommendation from a cousin in Natchez. A pregnant woman traveling to her sister's home near Lafayette, who never arrived despite the road being clear and safe. Their names were recorded in his ledger as arrived, based on sightings by townspeople, but never departed, despite the obvious need for such travelers to continue their journeys. More troubling still, none had ever appeared at his church seeking spiritual counsel or comfort, which was unusual for people traveling alone through dangerous country. Most wayfarers made a point of checking in with the local pastor, both for blessing and for information about road conditions ahead. Laurent's unease deepened when he began paying closer attention to the sisters' resources and methods. They never purchased livestock from any source he could identify. Not once had they bought poultry, goats, cattle, or meat cuts from local farmers or the markets in nearby settlements. No area farmer had sold to them in months, yet their preservation house chimney continued puffing smoke daily, sometimes around the clock, during what they claimed were intensive curing periods. The mathematical impossibility of their situation became more apparent the longer he observed. The preservation house itself was another source of concern. Unlike normal smokehouse or meat curing operations, it remained sealed and locked, except during the mysterious periods when black smoke poured from its chimney. The building was larger than necessary for a typical family's. One Sunday afternoon, as Laurent stood behind the chapel's oak doors, watching the congregation disperse after services, he observed Ophelia crossing the square in her stained apron, carrying a wicker basket covered with white cloth. The smell that emanated from the basket was rich and appetizing. But underneath the herbs and spices was that same metallic note he always detected around the preservation house. She placed the basket on the community gathering table where people often shared food after church, smiled her quiet smile, and departed without speaking to anyone. Children ran to the table immediately, followed by adults who praised the tenderness and flavor of the meat with an enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. Not one soul questioned its origin or wondered how the sisters had produced such abundance when their neighbors were reduced to trapping rabbits and fishing in increasingly barren waters. Laurent sat alone on the chapel steps that evening, trying to articulate his growing dread. The suspicion that clawed at his mind seemed too terrible to voice, too monstrous to believe. Yet the evidence continued accumulating like sediment in still water. The town was being fed, Certainly, but it wasn't a blessing from divine providence. It was payment for something, a transaction whose terms remained hidden, but whose cost was becoming increasingly apparent to anyone willing to see. Laurent had the terrible feeling that the price had already been collected multiple times, and that the community's willingness to remain blind to the obvious was not innocence, but complicity. Later that week, he was the kind of man who didn't frighten easily, who had seen enough of human nature to be suspicious of generosity that came without explanation. Laurent approached him at the general store and quietly urged caution. "Don't accept lodging with the Marchand sisters," he said, keeping his voice low. "Don't consume their food. Just conduct your business and move on quickly." Marcus laughed, but not unkindly. "Preacher, I've traveled through darker hollows than this one. I've dealt with river pirates and Confederate deserters and men who cut your throat for the coins in your pocket. Two sweet ladies feeding the poor and offering hospitality to travelers? I've seen worse threats in church socials. I'll take my chances with their cooking over sleeping rough in the swamp." He was seen entering the Marchand home around dusk, his horse still saddled and his cart loaded with goods he planned to sell in settlements further south. The sisters greeted him at their door with warm smiles and gracious words, welcoming him as they did all travelers who sought their hospitality. By morning, his horse remained tied at the post, still saddled, growing restless from thirst and hunger. His cart sat in the same position, still loaded with its cargo of tools and dry goods. But Marcus Bell was nowhere to be found. When Laurent made inquiries around town, asking if anyone had seen the trader depart, the responses were vague and unconcerned. "Probably left early," suggested the postmaster. "Some of these traveling men like to get on the road before dawn." "Probably took the east road," added the blacksmith. "Traders sometimes change their plans depending on what news they hear." But Laurent had checked the east road himself at first light, looking for wheel ruts or hoof prints. The path was undisturbed, the mud showing no sign of recent passage. That night, the preservation house chimney belched its usual black stream of smoke, but thicker and more pungent than Laurent had ever observed. The smell carried further than normal, reaching even the rectory where he tried to sleep. He opened his windows, hoping for fresh air, but instead gagged at the aroma that filled his room. It was strong, almost overwhelmingly rich, like roasted pork soaked in wine and herbs. But underneath the appetizing scents was something else, something that made his stomach churn and his hands shake as he reached for his crucifix. The metallic smell was stronger now, unmistakable. It was the scent of fresh blood, of meat so recently killed that it still held the iron taste of life. Laurent lit every candle in his room, knelt before his small altar, and whispered prayers for Marcus Bell's soul, though he could not yet bring himself to voice what he feared had become of the trader's body. The next morning, as if nothing unusual had occurred, Celeste herself appeared at the chapel, carrying a tray of sliced meat wrapped in parchment and tied with ribbon. The meat was pale and tender, seasoned with herbs that made Laurent's mouth water despite his growing horror. "For the congregation," she said with that same gentle smile that had charmed the town for years. "We so enjoy sharing our bounty with those in need. It's what Christian charity demands of us all." Laurent stared at her, searching her face for some crack in the mask, some slip in the performance, some flicker of darkness in her pale blue eyes. But she stood there as elegant and composed as always, her graying hair pinned neatly with silver combs, her skin clean and unblemished, her dress pressed and proper. There was nothing overtly monstrous about her appearance, nothing that would justify the accusations forming in his mind. She looked like what she claimed to be, a genteel woman of charitable disposition, sharing her family's good fortune with her community. Laurent accepted the tray with trembling hands, thanked her politely and waited until she departed before carrying it to the chapel garden. There, behind the small plot where he grew vegetables for the church suppers, he dug a hole and buried the entire offering, parchment and all, his hands shaking as he covered it with soil and whispered prayers over the makeshift grave. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong in Willowbrook, and Pastor Laurent now understood with crystalline clarity that the town didn't want to discover the truth. The meat was too good, the sisters were too generous, and the hunger had become too familiar. The people had made their choice long ago, trading their willingness to see for the comfort of full bellies and satisfied appetites. They had chosen blindness over truth, satiation over righteousness, and Laurent was beginning to understand that he stood alone in his growing horror. The next step, he knew, would require more than prayer and more than suspicion. It would require evidence that could not be ignored or explained away, proof so undeniable that even the most determined self-deception could not dismiss it. He prayed that he would find, but in his heart, he already knew what he would discover, and the knowledge filled him with the dread that prayer could not diminish. Evidence, he realized, might be the easy part. The difficult part would be convincing a town that had grown fat on horror to care about the source of their prosperity. Soon, as Laurent feared and expected, a child would go missing, and all doubts would be consumed in the fire of undeniable truth. There's a reason children are warned to avoid certain places in the world, not because the locations themselves are dangerous, but because they listen with ears that hear everything, see with eyes that miss nothing, and remember with minds unclouded by the convenient lies adults tell themselves. Children have not yet learned the art of selective blindness that allows grown people to ignore obvious truths when those truths prove inconvenient or uncomfortable. Pierre Melanchon was only 11 years old, wiry and curious, with eyes too large for his narrow face and a habit of disappearing from adult supervision whenever something interesting caught his attention. His father, Thomas, worked as a trapper and occasional carpenter when game was scarce, keeping the boy close under his watchful eye since his wife had died of fever 3 years earlier. But children born in places like Willowbrook develop an uncanny ability to slip through cracks in adult attention, especially when the fog rolls in thick and the adults are distracted by their own carefully maintained delusions. The Marchand property fascinated Pierre in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Every time the sisters brought food to the village, every time smoke curled from their chimney into the gray sky, every time he heard the adults whispering about their incredible generosity and mysterious prosperity, he found himself wondering about the practical details that seemed to escape everyone else's attention. He had spent enough time helping his father trap and dress game to understand the basics of meat preparation and preservation. He knew how much work was involved in processing a single deer or wild pig, how much salt and time were required to properly cure meat for long-term storage. The mathematical impossibility of the sisters' operation gnawed at his young mind like a puzzle that needed solving. He had never seen them purchase animals from any local source. His father had never sold them so much as a rabbit or squirrel. No farmers in the area had cattle or pigs to spare, and the few families who kept chickens had lost them all to disease months ago. Yet there was always meat coming from the preservation house, always smoke rising from the chimney, always the rich aroma of curing flesh drifting across the settlement. Pierre had asked his father about it once, but Thomas had cuffed him on the ear and told him not to question Christian charity when it came from good women trying to help their neighbors. Some folks are just blessed with abundance, his father had said. Our job is to be grateful, not to pry into what ain't our business. But the answer didn't satisfy Pierre's curiosity, and the warning only made the mystery more intriguing. So one afternoon, while his father slept off a bottle of cane liquor purchased with money earned from repairing the blacksmith's wagon, and while the village took its customary Sunday rest, Pierre followed a narrow gap between two ancient cypress trees and crept toward the back of the Marchand cottage. He moved quiet as a breath, staying low to the ground the way his father had taught him when stalking deer, using every shadow and tree trunk to conceal his approach. The preservation house loomed before him like something from a fever dream, its walls blackened with years of smoke and moisture, its windows boarded over with planks that had warped and split with age. The building looked less like a normal smokehouse and more like a wound in the earth, a place built not for the preservation of food, but for concealing activities that required absolute privacy. Heavy chains secured the main doors, and the single chimney breathed constantly like the throat of some buried beast. Pierre circled the building carefully, looking for any gap or opening that might allow him to see inside. Most of the structure was sealed tight, but on the back wall, he discovered a thin seam where two boards had warped apart, creating a space just wide enough for a child's eye. He crouched low, pressed his face to the gap, and peered into the smoky interior. What he saw destroyed his childhood in an instant and planted seeds of horror that would grow in his nightmares for the rest of his brief life. Hanging from iron hooks driven into heavy oak beams was not the carcass of any animal he recognized. It was a man, stripped naked and suspended upside down, his throat opened in a precise surgical cut that had drained his blood into buckets positioned beneath the body. The man's back had been carved with careful incisions, strips of flesh peeled away with the skill of an expert butcher. Steam rose from the exposed meat, as if the killing had been recent, perhaps within the last few hours. The room was filled with other horrors that Pierre's young mind struggled to process. Tables stained dark with old blood, knives and cleavers arranged with surgical precision, buckets and basins filled with liquids that might have been brine or blood or both. And in the far corner, partially hidden by shadow and smoke, what appeared to be other bodies in various stages of processing, some hanging, some laid out on wooden tables, all bearing the marks of careful, methodical butchery. The smell that filled the preservation house was not the clean aroma of properly cured meat, but something far more disturbing. It was the scent of recent death mixed with herbs and spices, the smell of human flesh being processed like any other meat, treated with the same care and attention that a normal butcher might give to beef or pork. The metallic undertone that Pastor Laurent had detected was indeed blood, fresh and abundant, the essence of life being systematically drained and processed. Pierre stumbled backward from the gap, his small hands pressed to his mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to burst from his throat. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift and spin as he turned and ran through the woods, crashing through underbrush and splashing through muddy streams in his desperate haste to escape. He burst into his father's cabin like a hurricane, babbling incoherently about bodies and hooks and blood, his words tumbling over each other in his frantic need to share what he had discovered. But Thomas Melanchon was still half drunk and completely unprepared to process his son's wild accusations. The boy's story was too monstrous to believe, too terrible to accept, too dangerous to investigate. Instead of listening carefully or considering the possibility that Pierre might be telling the truth, Thomas reacted with anger and disbelief. "You've been spying on those ladies again," he said, grabbing Pierre by the shoulders and shaking him roughly. "I warned you about making up stories and spreading lies about good Christian women. The Marchand sisters have been nothing but kind to this town, and I won't have my son repeating wicked tales about them." Thomas was speaking louder than necessary, as if trying to convince himself as much as his son. The alcohol in his system made him aggressive and defensive, unwilling to entertain thoughts that might complicate his simple understanding of the world. But Pierre kept insisting, his young voice rising in pitch as desperation overcame his natural obedience to his father. He described in graphic detail what he had seen through the gap in the boards, painting a picture so vivid and horrifying that Thomas began to grow genuinely disturbed. The boy was either telling the truth about something unspeakable, or he had developed a capacity for invention that bordered on the demonic. Either possibility was too terrible for a grieving widower trying to raise a son in a hostile world. All evening, Pierre continued to speak of what he had witnessed: the hanging figure, the careful butchery, the buckets of blood, the smell of death disguised as cured meat. He begged his father to investigate, to alert the sheriff, to warn the town about what was really happening in the preservation house. But Thomas's response grew more violent with each repetition, his fear expressing itself as rage at his son's persistence in telling such a disturbing tale. By dawn, Pierre was gone. His narrow bed was empty, the quilt still warm, but the boy nowhere to be found. His shoes remained by the door where he always left them. The front latch was undisturbed, and no one in the settlement had heard any sound during the night. It was as if the child had simply vanished into the thick bayou air, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of dread that no one wanted to acknowledge. The town's response was predictably muted. Some whispered that Pierre had run away, frightened by his father's drinking and violent temper. Others claimed he must have gotten lost in the swamp while wandering in the dark, perhaps falling victim to an alligator or snake. A few suggested he had gone seeking adventure in the wider world, following the same impulse that drove many young men to leave home in search of fortune and excitement. But only one man in Willowbrook, Pastor Laurent, believed that Pierre Melancon had discovered something terrible. And first the travelers who had never departed, then Marcus Bell the traitor, and now a local child whose only crime had been curiosity about something the adults were determined not to see. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, the evidence mounting like smoke from a fire that could not be contained forever. He visited Pierre's cabin to console the grieving father and to ask the questions that no one else dared voice. Thomas Melancon sat at his kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours earlier, his face gray with fear and guilt and the terrible knowledge that his son's wild story might have been true after all. When Laurent gently asked what Pierre had claimed to see behind the preservation house, Thomas hesitated for a long moment before nodding slowly. "He said there was a body hanging on hooks," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Said it looked like a man, but butchered like a pig. Said there was blood everywhere and tables covered with meat." The father's hands shook as he continued. "I told him he was seeing things, that he was making up wicked lies, but now—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too monstrous to voice, too terrible to accept, too dangerous to investigate. Laurent didn't push for more details. He could see that Thomas was already consumed with guilt and fear, wondering if his disbelief had cost his son's life. Instead, the pastor offered what comfort he could and made his own careful inquiries around the settlement. Had anyone heard unusual sounds from the direction of the Marchand property? Had anyone seen Pierre after sunset on the day he disappeared? Had anyone noticed increased activity around the preservation house? The answers were consistently negative, but Laurent detected something else in people's responses: a studied indifference, a careful avoidance of eye contact, a willingness to change the subject too quickly. They didn't want to know what had happened to Pierre, because knowing would require them to act, and action would threaten the comfortable arrangement they had with the Marchand sisters. That night, Laurent couldn't sleep. He paced the narrow aisles of his chapel, walking barefoot on cold stone while whispering prayers that felt increasingly inadequate. Outside, the fog pressed against the stained glass windows, like spirits too impatient to wait for invitation. And somewhere in the distance, the preservation house chimney continued its eternal exhalation of black smoke. The smell that drifted on the night air was thicker than usual, richer and more pungent, as if the sisters were working overtime to process something larger than their usual fare. The next morning brought a discovery that shattered any remaining hope that Pierre had simply wandered off or run away. Old Claude Boudreau, checking his fish traps in the muddy creek behind the preservation house, found a small leather satchel caught in the reeds. The bag was half buried in silt and tangled with Spanish moss, but its contents were unmistakably Pierre's. A wooden slingshot carved by his father, a small tin soldier painted in bright blue, a piece of hard candy wrapped in paper, and most damning of all, a strip of cloth torn from the boy's shirt, stained with something dark that could only be blood. Claude brought the satchel to the sheriff, old Henri Trosclair, whose arthritis and general weariness had long since made him reluctant to investigate anything more complex than cattle theft or public drunkenness. Henri examined the contents with the tired eyes of a man who had seen too much human misery and learned to avoid looking too closely at evidence that might complicate his peaceful existence. Could belong to anybody, he muttered, though the slingshot was clearly identifiable as Thomas Melancon's handiwork. Boys lose things in the woods all the time. Doesn't mean anything sinister happened. But Laurent knew better, and when he examined the blood-stained cloth, he recognized the pattern of the weave and the particular shade of blue dye that marked it as Pierre's shirt. The boy had indeed discovered something behind the preservation house, something worth killing for, something worth feeding to a town that had grown too comfortable with their prosperity to question its source. Laurent said nothing publicly about his conclusions. Instead, he returned to his rectory and stared at the single candle burning on his windowsill, whispering prayers for a child whose only mistake had been looking too closely at truths others chose to ignore. He added Pierre's name to the leather journal, where he recorded births, deaths, marriages, and disappearances, but he wrote it in a special section he had created for those whose fate remained uncertain. The list was growing longer each month, and each name represented not just a missing person, but a community's willingness to trade moral blindness for material comfort. Still, the smoke rose from the preservation house chimney. Still, the town gathered for communal meals, where the Marchand sisters provided meat that tasted better than anything available in New Orleans restaurants. Still, the people of Willowbrook had learned to see only what they needed to see, to taste only what they wanted to taste, to remember only what served their immediate needs. They had developed a collective amnesia that allowed them to forget uncomfortable questions in favor of comfortable lies. The sisters fed them, therefore the sisters were good. The meat was delicious, therefore its source was irrelevant. The town prospered while others starved, therefore they were blessed by providence rather than cursed by complicity. Laurent began to understand that his role in Willowbrook was not to save souls, but to witness horrors that others refused to acknowledge. He was the town's conscience, relegated to a position of irrelevant morality, while real power rested with those who controlled the food supply. His sermons about charity and righteousness rang hollow when the congregation went home to feast on flesh that had once walked among them as neighbors and strangers seeking shelter. The weight of knowledge pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Each night he dreamed of Pierre's young face, of Marcus's Belle's weathered hands, of all the travelers who'd approached the marchand door seeking hospitality and found instead a fate too terrible to imagine. He began to understand why his predecessor had died under mysterious circumstances and why the position of pastor in Willowbrook remained perpetually vacant despite the generous salary offered by the diocese. Nobody wanted to minister to a congregation that had sold its soul for the promise of never going hungry. Nobody wanted to offer spiritual guidance to people who had chosen damnation over starvation and found the bargain entirely acceptable. Laurent remained because leaving would mean abandoning the few innocent souls who still lived in Willowbrook, the children who hadn't yet learned to look away, the newcomers who hadn't yet been initiated into the town's terrible secret. But he also remained because someone needed to bear witness, to remember the names of the disappeared, to maintain some record of the crimes that prosperity had made invisible. If justice were ever to come to Willowbrook, it would need someone who had seen clearly, who had refused the comfortable blindness that the meat provided, who could testify to truths that others had chosen to forget. 2 weeks after Pierre's disappearance, the Marchand sisters appeared at Laurent's chapel door, carrying a covered dish that smelled of herbs and roasted meat. Their faces wore expressions of gentle concern. Their voices carried notes of sympathy and compassion that would have convinced anyone who didn't know better that they were genuinely grieving for the lost child. "We heard about poor little Pierre," Celeste said, her pale eyes moist with what appeared to be tears. "Such a tragedy when children wander off into the dangerous swamp. We thought you might appreciate a warm meal during this difficult time." She lifted the cover to reveal slices of tender meat arranged on a bed of wild rice, garnished with herbs that Laurent didn't recognize, but whose aroma made his stomach clench with involuntary hunger. "The boy was so curious about everything," Ophelia added in her soft voice, "always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked, perhaps too curious for his own good." There was something in her tone, a note of satisfaction barely concealed beneath the facade of sympathy that made Laurent's skin crawl with revulsion. He accepted the dish with hands that trembled only slightly, thanked the sisters for their thoughtfulness, and waited until they departed before carrying the meal to the same spot in the chapel garden where he had buried their previous offering. But this time, as he dug the hole, he whispered different prayers. Not prayers for the dead, but prayers for justice, for revelation, for the strength to do what needed to be done when the time came. The meat in the dish was pale and tender, younger than the usual offerings, seasoned with care and attention that spoke of pride and craftsmanship. Laurent didn't need to taste it to know what it was, didn't need confirmation to understand the sisters' message. They knew he suspected, and they were telling him in their own subtle way that curiosity, like Pierre's, could be dangerous for one's health. As he covered the dish with soil and stones, Laurent made a decision that would change everything. He could no longer simply observe and record. He could no longer content himself with bearing witness while others paid the price for his moral paralysis. If the town would not act to stop the horror, then he would have to act alone, regardless of the personal cost. The preservation house chimney continued to breathe its black smoke into the gray sky. And somewhere in the distance, a child's voice could be heard calling for help. But when Laurent strained to listen, he realized it was only the wind through the cypress trees carrying echoes of crimes that the living had chosen to forget. The next phase of his plan would require more than moral courage. It would require him to enter the darkness willingly, to risk everything for the chance to expose truths that his congregation had spent years learning to ignore. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with, and that meant getting inside the preservation house to see for himself what Pierre had discovered. Nobody saw Pastor Laurent on the morning he chose to break into the Marchand house, though it would have been more accurate to say that those who might have seen him had learned long ago to look away when circumstances suggested that ignorance might be safer than knowledge. The air hung thick with swamp heat and humidity, the kind of oppressive atmosphere that made thinking difficult and movement sluggish, perfectly suited for concealing activities that required absolute discretion. Willowbrook moved slowly that day, its inhabitants dulled by the weight of summer and the burden of secrets they carried like stones in their stomachs. The Marchand sisters had departed for the weekly market in nearby Thibodeau, their baskets swinging innocently as they walked, their faces bright with the anticipation of acquiring supplies for their mysterious work. Laurent had been watching their patterns for weeks, noting their schedules and habits with the patience of a hunter studying dangerous prey. The sisters' cottage stood like a monument to deception, its whitewashed walls and carefully tended garden presenting an image of domestic tranquility that masked horrors beyond imagination. Lace curtains fluttered in windows that revealed nothing of the activities within, and flower boxes overflowed with herbs that Laurent now suspected were used for more than mere seasoning. The entire property radiated an aura of welcome that felt increasingly sinister the more he learned about its occupants. Laurent circled the house twice, checking for neighbors who might observe his activities, listening for sounds that might indicate the sisters had returned early from their marketing expedition. Satisfied that he was unobserved, he approached the back door and examined the lock with hands that had grown steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. The mechanism was simple enough, designed more for privacy than security, and the blade of his ceremonial crucifix proved adequate to slip the latch. The door opened with a soft groan that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Laurent paused, listening for any sound that might indicate his intrusion had been detected, but the house remained silent as a tomb. He crossed the threshold into a kitchen that smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something metallic and organic that he was learning to associate with the sisters' work. The interior of the house was a masterpiece of domestic performance, every detail calculated to reinforce the image of genteel Christian women living quiet lives of charitable service. Dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the ceiling beams, their aromatic presence masking less pleasant odors that lurked beneath the surface. A harpsichord dominated the parlor, its yellowed keys suggesting years of... It wasn't until he noticed a loose floorboard beneath the rocking chair in Ophelia's bedroom that Laurent's systematic search yielded results. The board had been deliberately loosened, its edges worn smooth by repeated removal, and when he pried it up with his crucifix, he discovered a hiding place that contained the evidence he had been seeking. The leather-bound journal that rested in the hidden cavity was elegant and expensive, bound in calfskin and clothed with a brass clasp that showed signs of frequent use. The leather was darkened with age and stained with substances that Laurent preferred not to identify. But the craftsmanship spoke of quality and care, as if the record it contained was precious to its keeper. Laurent opened the journal with trembling hands, unprepared for the meticulous documentation of horror that filled its pages. The handwriting was beautiful, flowing script that belonged in poetry or love letters rather than records of systematic murder. Each entry was dated and numbered, creating a chronological catalog of crimes that stretched back nearly 20 years. "This is not for God to read," began the inscription on the first page. "This is not for guilt or confession or redemption. This is only for remembering, for preserving the details that make each experience unique and meaningful. We are artists, and this is our gallery of masterpieces." The entries that followed were clinical in their precision and disturbing in their casual tone. Each page listed a victim by name when known, described their physical characteristics, documented the circumstances of their capture, and provided detailed notes about the Samuel Morse, April 1847, read one early entry. Traveling tinker, approximately 40 years of age, lean but tough. Complained excessively during processing, which may have affected meat quality. Brine solution required adjustment. Flavor bitter, likely due to subject's advanced years and poor diet. Future selections should prioritize younger specimens. Laurent felt his stomach clench as he read entry after entry, each one describing a human being reduced to nothing more than raw material for the sisters' culinary experiments. The clinical language made the horror worse somehow, transforming murder into mere technique, reducing complex lives to simple problems of meat preparation and flavor enhancement. Martha Ross, July 1849, continued another entry. Widow traveling to live with daughter in Natchez. Plump and well-fed, excellent marbling throughout. Minimal struggle during restraint phase. Processing proceeded smoothly. Fat content ideal for rendering, produced superior bacon and excellent roasts. Subject's pious nature may have contributed to tenderness. Consider targeting religious travelers in future. The journal documented a learning process, a systematic refinement of technique that spoke of intelligence applied to evil purposes. The sisters had experimented with different methods of killing, various approaches to butchering, alternative recipes for brining and curing. They had developed preferences based on age, gender, physical condition, and even personality traits, creating a taxonomy of human flesh that treated people like livestock to be evaluated and processed. Benjamin Pine, May 1850, read another entry that made Laurent's hands save portions for special occasions. But it was the entries near the end of the journal that truly destroyed Laurent's ability to maintain emotional distance from what he was reading. The sisters had not limited themselves to adults, had not restricted their crimes to strangers passing through town. Local residents, people Laurent knew by name and face, appeared in the later pages alongside their calculated descriptions and cooking recommendations. Thomas Michel, November 1838, read an entry that made Laurent gasp aloud. Nephew of former pastor, young man of good family, well-educated and clean living, disappeared during hunting expedition. Excellence quality throughout, minimal waste. Subject's refined upbringing reflected in superior flavor. Consider targeting educated class more frequently. Thomas Michel had been Pastor Laurent's predecessor's nephew, a young seminary student who had vanished during what was thought to be a hunting accident. Laurent remembered the old pastor mentioning his grief over the loss, his guilt at failing to prevent his nephew from venturing into dangerous swamp territory alone. Now Laurent understood that the young man had never reached the swamp, had never faced danger from alligators or snakes or treacherous footing. He had been killed and consumed by women his uncle had trusted, women who had probably comforted the grieving pastor with food prepared from his nephew's flesh. The final entry in the journal was recent, the ink still fresh enough to smudge under Laurent's trembling fingers. Pierre Melancon, September 1856. Local child, approximately. The clinical descriptions had reduced Pierre to nothing more than a culinary experiment, had transformed the boy's curiosity and courage into simple problems of operational security. The child had died, not because he posed any real threat to the sisters' activities, but because maintaining their secret was more important than preserving innocent life. But the journal contained more than just records of past crimes. The final pages outlined future plans, discussed techniques for expanding their operation, considered the possibility of recruiting additional participants or establishing similar enterprises in neighboring settlements. The Marchand sisters were not content with their current level of activity. They were planning to increase their harvest of human flesh, to refine their methods, to turn their individual crimes into something approaching an industry. Laurent replaced the journal in its hiding place and carefully repositioned the loose floorboard, leaving no sign that the sisters' secret had been discovered. But as he prepared to leave the house, he noticed something else that hadn't been apparent during his initial search. The preservation house was connected to the main dwelling by an underground passage, concealed beneath a rug in the pantry and secured with a trap door that required significant strength to open. The passage was narrow and low, forcing Laurent to crawl through darkness that seemed to press against him like a living thing. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and preservation chemicals, but underneath those familiar odors lurked something far more disturbing, the smell of recent death, of blood and flesh and fear that had soaked into the earth itself. The passage opened into a chamber beneath the preservation house that served as the sisters' primary workshop. Iron hooks hung from oak beams like instruments of torture, their surfaces stained dark with years of use. Tables lined the walls, their wooden surfaces scarred and discolored from countless sessions of butchering and dismemberment. Buckets and barrels contained substances that Laurent didn't want to identify, and the floor was fitted with drains that allowed blood and other fluids to flow away into the swamp. But it was the corner of the chamber that contained the most damning evidence. A pile of clothing, neatly folded and sorted by size and quality, represented the final possessions of victims who had trusted the sisters' hospitality. Laurent recognized Pierre's small shirt, Marcus Bell's leather vest, garments belonging to travelers he had recorded as missing but never found. Each piece of clothing was a life that had ended in this underground chamber, a person who had been reduced to meat for the sisters' preservation house. Beside the clothing stood a wooden chest that Laurent opened with hands that had progressed beyond trembling into complete numbness. Inside were personal effects that the sisters had collected like trophies: watches, jewelry, coins, letters, family portraits, religious medals. Each item represented someone's treasured possession, something they had carried as a connection to home and family and the life they had left behind. Laurent found Pierre's slingshot among the collection, the wooden handle polished smooth by young hands that would never again shape it into projectiles for hunting birds or annoying adults. He found Marcus Bell's leather wallet, still containing the trader's identification papers and a small daguerreotype of a woman who might have been his wife or sister or daughter. He found religious medals belonging to faithful travelers who had trusted in God's protection and found instead something that challenged every assumption about divine justice and human nature. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, sufficient to convict the sisters of crimes that would horrify any civilized court. The last evidence Laurent found was a container holding the ashes of burned bones. He touched the ashes with trembling fingers, knowing that he was looking at the sole remains of the sisters' victims who had not been butchered for food, but rather killed to prevent being caught. He felt a sense of dread as he realized that the sisters had taken care to cover their tracks. Anyone who came looking for Pierre or the others would find nothing but ashes and the sisters' feigned reputation as respectable keepers of a small house in the Tanglewood. He knew that he had no choice but to bring the sisters to justice. He had to ensure that they could no longer prey on innocent travelers. He took the container of ashes and stowed it with the other evidence in the pile of clothing that now served as a tomb for the lost souls of the swamp. But Laurent understood that evidence alone would not be enough to bring justice to Willowbrook. The town had invested too much in its willful blindness, had grown too comfortable with its prosperity, had developed too strong a taste for the sisters' offerings to accept proof that would destroy their carefully constructed illusions. Laurent emerged from the underground chamber with a plan forming in his mind, a course of action that would require him to abandon his role as observer and become an active participant in events. He had seen enough to know that the horror was real, documented enough to understand its scope, collected enough evidence to prove the sisters' guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Now he needed to decide whether to present that evidence to authorities who might or might not act, or to take more direct action that would ensure justice was served regardless of the community's willingness to face uncomfortable truths. The preservation house chimney continued its eternal exhalation as Laurent made his way back through the underground passage, and somewhere in the smoke he could smell the essence of lives that had been reduced to flavoring for a town's meals. The weight of knowledge pressed down on him like a physical burden, but it was balanced by a growing determination to end the horror, whatever the personal cost might be. Back in his rectory, Laurent sat before his altar and contemplated the choices that lay before him. He could report his discoveries to the sheriff, though Henri Trosclair had already demonstrated his reluctance to investigate the sisters' activities. He could write to his superiors in the diocese, though explaining the situation in a letter would likely result in his removal for mental instability rather than any meaningful. He could confront the sisters directly, though that would almost certainly result in his joining the collection of personal effects in their underground chamber. Or he could take action that would expose the truth in a way that even Willowbrook's determined blindness could not ignore. Could create evidence so dramatic and undeniable that the town would be forced to confront what it had been consuming. Could ensure that justice was served, even if it meant sacrificing his own life in the process. Laurent opened his journal and began to write, documenting everything he had seen and discovered, creating a record that would survive even if he did not. But he also began to plan, to consider approaches that would require him to become something other than a passive observer of evil. The time for prayer and documentation was ending. The time for action was about to begin. As night fell over Willowbrook, the preservation house chimney glowed red against the darkening sky, and Laurent could hear the sound of the sisters returning from their marketing expedition. Their voices carried across the settlement like a benediction, warm and reassuring to ears that had learned to associate their presence with comfort and prosperity. But Laurent now heard something else in their voices, something that spoke of satisfaction with their work and the anticipation of future opportunities. The harvest season was approaching, and with it would come increased traffic of travelers seeking shelter and supplies before winter set in. The sisters were preparing for their busiest time of year, when the preservation house would operate at full capacity and the town would feast on abundance that came at a price too terrible for most to calculate. But this year would be different.
This year, Laurent would be watching with eyes that saw clearly, would be waiting with knowledge that demanded action, would be prepared to ensure that the feast came to an end, whatever the cost to himself or to a community that had chosen damnation over starvation and found the bargain entirely acceptable. The final confrontation was approaching, and Laurent could only pray that when it came, he would have the courage to do what needed to be done and the strength to bear witness to truths that others had spent years learning to ignore. The preservation house chimney continued to breathe its black smoke into the Louisiana night, but soon that smoke would carry more than the aroma of cured meat and exotic spices. Soon it would carry the scent of justice, burning clean and bright through the darkness that had settled over Willowbrook like a curse that fed on silence and grew strong on willful blindness. The harvest was about to begin, but this time, the crop would be very different from what the sisters expected. There are moments in a man's life when faith alone proves insufficient, when prayer becomes inadequate, when the comfortable distance between righteousness and action collapses into nothing. By the third night after his discovery of the journal and the underground chamber, Pastor Laurent had reached such a moment. He understood with crystalline clarity that Willowbrook had made its collective choice long ago, had traded its moral authority for the promise of never going hungry, had chosen comfort over conscience, and found the bargain entirely satisfactory. The town would not demand justice for the disappeared, would not insist on investigation or prosecution or any meaningful response to the horror that had been feeding them for nearly 2 decades. They had invested too much in their willful blindness, had grown too dependent on the sisters' generosity, had developed too strong an addiction to the impossible abundance that prosperity in a time of famine provided. If justice were to come to Willowbrook, it would have to be delivered rather than requested, imposed rather than chosen, forced upon a community that had demonstrated its unwillingness to face uncomfortable truths. Laurent spent those 3 sleepless nights studying the sisters' routines, memorizing their patterns of movement, planning an approach that would allow him to enter their domain under circumstances that would give him some chance of survival and success. The plan that emerged from his careful observation was both simple and terrifying in its implications. He would have to become what the sisters loved most, a vulnerable stranger seeking shelter, someone whose disappearance would raise no immediate alarm, someone who could get close enough to expose their crimes in a way that even Willowbrook's determined blindness could not ignore. It would require him to place himself completely at their mercy, to trust in providence and his own ability to survive long enough to reveal the truth. Laurent spent the final day before his planned infiltration in preparation that was both practical and spiritual. He removed his clerical collar and vestments, replacing them with the worn clothing of a traveling laborer. He soiled his appearance, roughened his hands, adopted the posture and speech patterns of a man who had spent years working with his hands rather than ministering to souls. He practiced the story he would tell, rehearsed the vulnerability he would need to project, prepared himself mentally for the performance that would either expose the truth or cost him his life. As the sun set on what might be his final day as pastor of Willowbrook, Laurent knelt before his altar and whispered prayers that were part supplication and part farewell. He prayed for the souls of those who had already died, for the wisdom to act justly, for the courage to face whatever horrors awaited him in the preservation house. He prayed for the people of Willowbrook, that they might find the strength to face the truth when it was finally revealed, and for his own soul, that his actions might serve justice rather than mere vengeance. When full darkness had settled over the settlement, Laurent emerged from his rectory as a different man entirely. Gone was the young pastor with his earnest sermons and obvious education. In his place walked a weathered laborer, head down and shoulders stooped, following the familiar path toward the Marchand cottage with the uncertain steps of a stranger navigating unfamiliar territory. The cottage glowed with warm lamplight, its windows revealing glimpses of domestic tranquility that Laurent now knew concealed horrors beyond imagination. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy spirals, carrying the scent of a hearty supper that made his empty stomach clench with involuntary hunger. Everything about the scene suggested welcome, hospitality, the promise of shelter and sustenance for weary travelers.
Laurent approached the front door with the hesitant manner of a man who had swallowed his pride to ask for charity, someone who needed help but was embarrassed to request it. When Ophelia answered his soft knock, he kept his eyes downcast and his voice humble, playing the role of a desperate stranger seeking mercy from Christian women known for their generous hearts. "Evening, ma'am," he said, affecting the accent of the rural parishes rather than his educated speech. "Lost the road near the river band some hours back. Wondering if you might have a spot where a man could rest for the night. I can work for my keep. Got strong hands and a willing spirit." Ophelia blinked once, studying his appearance with eyes that seemed to catalog details for some internal inventory. Then her face brightened with the warm smile that had welcomed dozens of victims to their fate, and Laurent felt his skin crawl with the knowledge of what that expression really meant. "Of course, poor thing," she said in her soft voice, stepping back to allow him entry. "We never turn away a soul in need, especially one who's lost his way in this treacherous country. Come in, come in. You must be hungry and tired from your wandering." The interior of the cottage felt different now that Laurent knew its secrets, charged with malevolent energy that made every shadow seem pregnant with threat. But he maintained his pose of grateful humility, accepting the chair Ophelia offered near the hearth and expressing appropriate amazement at the comfort and cleanliness of the home. Celeste emerged from the kitchen carrying a tea service that included delicate china cups and a pot that steamed with aromatic vapors. Her greeting was as warm as her sister's, her concern for his welfare apparently genuine, her hospitality beyond reproach. To any normal traveler, the sisters would have seemed like guardian angels, Christian women living the gospel through their treatment of strangers and unfortunates. "You poor dear," Celeste said as she poured tea that smelled of chamomile and honey. "The roads can be so confusing in this part of the country, especially after dark. You're fortunate to have found us rather than wandering into the deep swamp where the dangers are very real indeed." Laurent accepted the cup with hands that trembled only slightly, lifting it to his lips while maintaining the grateful expression of a man overwhelmed by unexpected kindness. But he had learned enough about the sisters' methods to recognize the subtle cloudiness of the tea, the too sweet aroma that suggested herbs more potent than mere chamomile. They were drugging him, preparing him for processing with the same care they had shown every previous victim. He pretended to drink while actually allowing the liquid to merely wet his lips, then let the cup slip from his fingers as if sudden drowsiness had overcome his coordination. The porcelain shattered against the hearthstones, and Laurent allowed his head to fall forward onto his chest as if consciousness were slipping away despite his efforts to remain alert. Through half-closed eyes, he watched the sisters' transformation from gracious hostesses to efficient predators. The warm smiles disappeared, replaced by expressions of cold calculation and professional assessment. They moved toward him with the coordinated precision of partners who had performed this dance many times before, their gentle hands becoming restraints as they prepared to transport him to the preservation house. "He'll do nicely," Celeste said, her voice now devoid of the warmth that had characterized her earlier speech. Thin but not emaciated, probably clean living based on his speech patterns, should provide decent yield with proper preparation. "Older than ideal," Ophelia murmured as she examined Laurent's hand. "But the muscle tone suggests physical labor, which often produces superior texture. We'll need to adjust the brine solution accordingly." Laurent remained limp as they lifted him from the chair, allowing his body to be dead weight that they had to manage carefully to avoid injury to themselves. They were strong for their size, he realized, strengthened by years of moving bodies and handling the physical demands of their grisly work. But they were also confident in their routine, certain that their drug had rendered him helpless and unaware of what was happening. The sisters carried him through the cottage and out the back door, following a path that led through the garden toward the preservation house. The night air was thick with humidity, and the scent of flowers that bloomed only in darkness, their sweet perfume providing a grotesque counterpoint to the horror that was about to unfold. Laurent could hear the soft sounds of their movement, their whispered discussions of technique and timing, their casual planning of his dismemberment and consumption. The preservation house loomed before them like a monument to systematic evil, its weathered walls containing decades of accumulated horror. The sisters unlocked the heavy door with keys that jangled softly in the night air, then carried Laurent into the chamber where Pierre had glimpsed truths too terrible for a child's understanding. The interior was exactly as Laurent had seen it during his clandestine exploration, but experiencing it as a victim rather than an observer added dimensions of terror that his imagination had not. They placed him on one of the tables, and Laurent felt the cold wood against his back while fighting to remain motionless despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The sisters moved around him with professional efficiency, gathering the tools they would need for his processing, discussing the best approaches for maximizing yield and flavor from his particular body type. "We'll start with the standard exsanguination," Celeste said, selecting a knife whose blade gleamed with razor sharpness. "Then proceed with the primary cuts while the meat is still fresh. The preservation solution has been prepared according to the autumn formula, which should complement his probable diet and activity level." Laurent waited until Celeste leaned over him with the knife positioned above his throat before opening his eyes and speaking in a voice that carried all the authority of his true calling. "In the name of God and all the souls you have murdered, your reign of horror ends tonight." The sisters recoiled in shock, their carefully planned routine shattered by the revelation that their victim was conscious and aware. But Laurent didn't wait for them to recover from their surprise. He rolled off the table and away from Celeste's knife. "You came here to spy on us," she said, her voice now carrying a cold fury that made Laurent's blood freeze in his veins. "You're that meddling priest who's been asking too many questions, aren't you? We should have dealt with you months ago when you first started poking around where you don't belong." Celeste moved to flank him from the other side, her knife still ready to open his throat at the first opportunity. "We tried to be subtle," she said, her cultured accent now tinged with something ancient and malevolent. "We left you gifts, warnings wrapped in hospitality. But you couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? You couldn't accept the blessing we've given this community." Laurent backed against the wall, his eyes darting between the two women who had transformed from gracious hostesses into efficient killers in the span of moments. The preservation house felt smaller now, more confined, the walls pressing in like the sides of a tomb. But he had not come this far to be intimidated by the very evil he had sworn to expose. "Blessing," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "You call the systematic murder and consumption of innocent people a blessing? You've turned this entire town into accomplices to cannibalism? Made them feast on human flesh while telling themselves it's divine providence?" Ophelia laughed, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to echo from the very walls of the preservation house. "Innocent? The people who come to our door are wanderers, criminals, deserters, people fleeing their past or running from justice. We're performing a service, cleaning the roads of human refuse while providing sustenance for a worthy community." "And the children?" Laurent demanded, thinking of Pierre's young face and the clinical description of his murder in the sister's journal. "What crime did Pierre Melanchon commit that justified his death? What sin did Thomas Michel carry that made him worthy of your table?" Celeste's smile was colder than winter ice. The boys saw too much, and the seminary student asked too many questions. Just like you, priest. Some people simply cannot accept the natural order, cannot understand that survival requires difficult choices and moral flexibility. Laurent realized that reasoning with them was pointless, that they had passed beyond any possibility of redemption or reform. They had been killing and consuming human flesh for so long that they no longer saw their victims as people, had developed a worldview that justified any atrocity in service of their appetites and the town's prosperity. The natural order, he said, playing for time while searching for any opportunity to escape or turn the situation to his advantage. You speak of nature, but you've created something unnatural, something that violates every law of God and man. God? Ophelia's voice rose to a shriek that seemed to come from something inhuman. Where was God when the drought killed our crops? Where was He when disease took our livestock? Where was He when children starved while plantation owners feasted? We found our own providence, created our own abundance through intelligence and will and the courage to do what was necessary. Laurent saw his chance when Celeste stepped closer, her knife raised for a killing stroke. Instead of retreating further, he lunged forward, grasping her wrist with both hands and twisting until she dropped the blade with a cry of pain. But Ophelia was already moving, her cleaver whistling through the air toward his head with enough force to split his skull.
He rolled away from the blow, feeling the wind of its passage ruffle his hair, then scrambled toward the door while the sisters recovered their footing. But the preservation house had been designed to contain struggling victims, and every escape route was blocked by furniture, equipment, or the sisters themselves as they moved to cut off his flight. Laurent's hand closed on a bucket of what he hoped was preserving brine, and he hurled its contents at Celeste as she advanced with murder in her eyes. The liquid struck her face and chest, and she screamed in agony as whatever chemicals it contained began eating through her skin like acid. The smell that rose from her burning flesh was nauseating, but it gave Laurent the distraction he needed to reach the oil lamp that provided the chamber's only illumination. "You want to see the natural order?" he shouted, raising the lamp above his head. "Let me show you what happens when evil finally burns." He hurled the lamp against the wall where containers of preserving chemicals and oil were stored, and the entire preservation house erupted in flames that seemed to have been waiting years for this moment of release. Fire raced along the walls and ceiling with supernatural speed, consuming the evidence of decades of horror, while filling the air with smoke that carried the essence of every life that had ended in this cursed place. The sisters' screams rose above the roar of the flames, but they were no longer entirely human sounds. Something in their voices spoke of fury beyond mortal capacity, of hatred that transcended individual personality and became a force of pure malevolence. They continued to pursue Laurent even as fire consumed their clothing and flesh, their devotion to murder stronger than their instinct for self-preservation. Laurent burst through the preservation house door with flames licking at his heels and the sisters' inhuman shrieks echoing behind him. But he didn't run towards safety or attempt to flee the property. Instead, he stood in the garden and watched as the building that had concealed so much horror finally revealed its secrets to the night sky. The fire spread with unnatural intensity, as if years of accumulated evil were finally finding release through flames that burned hotter and brighter than any normal conflagration. Windows exploded outward, sending shards of glass spinning through the air like fallen stars. The roof collapsed inward with a sound like thunder, and sparks rose into the darkness like the souls of the murdered, finally ascending to whatever judgment awaited them. The townspeople came running, some with buckets and some with tools, others simply drawn by the spectacle of destruction that lit up the night like a beacon. They formed a circle around the blazing preservation house,
but none made any serious attempt to fight the fire. Something in the flames, some quality of the light or the smoke or the sounds that emerged from the burning building warned them that this was not a fire to be fought, but a purification to be witnessed. Laurent stood among them, his clothes singed and his face blackened with smoke, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of justice finally served.
He watched as the preservation house burned itself clean, consuming not just the building and its contents, but the very ground on which it stood, as if the earth itself were being purified of the corruption that had festered there for so long. And in the flames, for just a moment, he thought he could see them, Pierre and Marcus Bell and all the others, their faces serene and grateful as the fire released them from the preservation house that had become their tomb. The smoke that rose from the burning building carried more than the scent of wood and chemicals. It carried the essence of liberation, of secrets finally revealed, of truth burning bright enough to illuminate even the darkest corners of willful blindness. When the fire finally died down to glowing embers, nothing remains of the preservation house but a blackened foundation and ash that would never support new growth. The ground itself seemed scorched beyond any possibility of renewal, marked permanently by the horror it had concealed and the justice that had finally consumed it. But Laurent's work was not finished. As the crowd began to disperse, as people started to return to their homes with troubled expressions and whispered conversations, he knew that the fire had only destroyed the physical evidence of the sisters' crimes. The real reckoning would come when Willowbrook was forced to confront what it had been consuming, what it had chosen to ignore, what it had traded for the promise of never going hungry. The preservation house was gone, but the guilt remained. The sisters were dead, but the complicity lived on. The physical horror had been burned away, but the moral corruption that had allowed it to flourish was still festering in the hearts and minds of people who had chosen comfort over conscience and found the bargain acceptable. Laurent walked back to his rectory as dawn began to break over Willowbrook, knowing that his real ministry was just beginning. He had exposed the evil, but now he had to help a community find the strength to face what they had become, to acknowledge their part in the horror, to seek redemption for sins that went far beyond mere ignorance or naivete. The smoke from the burned preservation house continued to rise into the morning sky, carrying with it the last traces of a horror that had fed on silence and grown strong on willful blindness. But it also carried the promise of truth finally revealed, of justice finally served, of a community that might yet find the courage to choose righteousness over convenience. Behind him, the ruins of the preservation house smoldered in the growing light, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of people weeping, whether from grief or guilt or relief, he could not tell. But they were no longer silent, no longer blind, no longer able to pretend that their prosperity had come without cost. The feast was over. The reckoning had begun, and Pastor Laurent walked toward an uncertain future, carrying the weight of terrible knowledge, but also the hope that truth, once revealed, might yet have the power to heal even the deepest wounds that evil could inflict upon the human soul. The fire had burned away more than just a building. It had burned away the comfortable lies that had allowed a community to feast on horror while telling themselves they were blessed. Now came the harder work of learning to live with truth, of finding redemption for complicity, of discovering whether a town that had chosen damnation for the promise of abundance could find its way back to grace. But that is another story, one that would unfold in the days and weeks and years to come as Willowbrook struggled to understand what it had been and what it might yet become. For now, it was enough that the preservation house was gone, that the sisters' reign of horror had ended,
that the smoke rising into the Louisiana sky carried the scent of justice finally served. In the end, some fires do more than destroy. Some fires purify. Some fires reveal. Some fires burn away the lies that allow evil to flourish in darkness. The Preservation House fire was such a flame, bright enough to illuminate truth, hot enough to consume deception, powerful enough to transform a community that had lost its way in the comfortable darkness of willful ignorance. The mist still clung to Willowbrook like a shroud, but now it carried different secrets, different possibilities, different hopes for a future that might yet be redeemed from the ashes of a horrible past. The flesh merchants were gone, but their legacy would live on in the memories of those who had feasted unknowingly on horror and would now have to learn to live with the taste of truth.